Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Garrigal, and I work with the Living Archives Project, where we are collecting stories of how COVID-19 impacted various communities in Charlotte, Mecklenburg County. Today is May 11th, 2023, and this week there were 24 reported cases of COVID-19 in the Charlotte, Mecklenburg County area, which actually shows a 57% decrease over the last 2 weeks. Therefore, each subject is comfortable not wearing a mask. Would you introduce yourself, Renee?
Sure. My name is Renee Colson, and I'm a resident of Charlotte.
Awesome. And would you briefly state your appearance?
Oh, sure. I'm a middle-aged African-American female, roughly about 5'2", but I like to think that I'm 5'3". I'm height challenged just a little bit. But I would say that I'm a slightly plus-size person. Right now I'm wearing long braids in my hair. They're a two-tone color. And I'm brown skin, African American female.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you, Renee. You have a beautiful smile.
Thank you.
So tell me, Renee, how long have you lived or worked in the Mecklenburg area?
Sure. Well, I'm a native of South Carolina, so I would drive into Charlotte a lot. So I've lived and or worked in Charlotte for roughly about 30 years, so I do consider it to be my home.
Wow, that's amazing. And so what do you do for work?
Sure. I'm an HR manager at Lion Services in the University area of Charlotte.
Great. Can you tell me a little bit about what does Lion Services do if there are those who don't know?
Sure. Well, we're what I would call that unicorn, as I was telling someone earlier. We are a nonprofit manufacturer, and we proudly produce things for the United States military. And about half of our population of employees are either legally blind or totally blind. So we are unusual, a proud employer. We probably employ the majority, the largest population of people with vision disabilities in the Charlotte area.
Wow, that's incredible. How many employees are there at Lion Services?
As of today, we have 202 employees.
202. Wow, that's incredible. And so, what makes Lion Services a little bit different than others?
But since we are a manufacturer, it is unusual for, I would say, a lot to have one shift. We only have one shift, which is a first shift work schedule. But what really makes us different is the opportunities that we make available to people with vision loss. And it's, we have people who are totally blind who've never seen in their lives. We've had people who've lost vision and who have progressively lost vision until they become totally blind. And then we have some people with very low vision, as I would call it. And so they can see enough to navigate, through the building and whatnot, but they may need help reading certain things.
Wow. And and over the last 3 years, would you say that there were either some challenges with supporting your employees and also going through the pandemic?
Well, I would definitely say so. I've only been there a year, so some of the things I hear is from a historical standpoint, but a lot of our employees depend on us for other support that they would normally get at home because they live independently.
Yeah.
But also because of COVID, to my understanding, like everybody else did, we had to deal with the 6 feet distance.
Yeah.
And so a lot of our employees who are blind use the CATS bus system, the STS buses. And typically now we may have 7 or 8 that come to the property.
Okay.
At that time, during the peak of COVID, during that social distancing 6 feet issue, to my understanding, we had maybe 25 to 30 buses because there can only be 2 to 3 people on a bus because they're smaller buses.
Yeah.
So, and I think just like most of us, during COVID, we were sort of forced to isolate ourselves. And when you have people who generally tend to be alone because they may live alone because they don't have either choose to or don't have a lot of family support, it can be hard, on a person, on their mental stability and, just overall mood. And I think we've all experienced that. So that's not unique to our population of employees, it just may be compounded a little bit because they are sometimes dependent on others who are sighted to help them.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
Renee, before we started talking, we did an activity together called a hand map.
Mhm.
Is there anything from your hand map that you would like to share with us? And you're welcome to pick it up.
Oh, thank you. Yes. In regards to COVID, how it impacted me directly?
In general, just
Okay.
you, your story, COVID.
I would definitely say, from my own personal experience, thinking about my faith, and I think we all did that. We, normally went to church. It was sort of like like a transactional process,
Yeah.
but maybe not always being truly grateful for what we had in that moment prior to COVID. And once COVID came, like a lot of us, and myself included, sort of running back to church.
Yeah.
And trying to do things and become more closer and in tune with our faith. It Dealing with COVID made you think about the basics and being grateful for the basics. So that's a really big thing for me.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that's huge. So tell me a little bit. You mentioned in the past that you're a mother.
Mhm.
So can you tell me a little bit about your daughters and about how did COVID impact your family?
Sure. Yes, I do have two girls. They are Lauren and Layla. They're 17 and 14 now. My youngest is preparing to go from 8th grade to 9th grade, and they're getting ready for the end of year activities. And in that school message, it was a reminder that her class of students started COVID in 6th grade, and going to the 6th grade. So they didn't have a normal start of the year.
Yeah.
That isolation was a problem, and creates issues for all of us, and especially for children. Having to learn on a computer was very difficult as well. In that transition, and if I remember correctly, they went the majority of the year, and then they started to try to go back, and then had to stop. But going to a new school and not being able to develop friendships and whatnot was very difficult. So they didn't become, I would say, in a more normal experience, a school experience, until the next following year. So that would have been 21, 22.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think we've seen a lot watching the news. I remember seeing news reports where, the school districts were having to check in with kids because the kids weren't reporting to school. And that was sort of an eye-opening thing for me, because the reality is a lot of kids go to school and that's their safe space.
Yeah.
And when they're not going to school, they may not be receiving, proper meals or proper care or whatnot. So it affects all kids, and my kids are no different. They have, issues that they're still working through.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so tell me a little bit about your own experience. How did you see yourself get impacted?
There was definitely a loneliness. My kids, they go back and forth between my ex-husband and I. So the parenting style's, a little different. And when you have to, I know there was a time when my daughter wanted to do a sleepover. It's sort of like the beginning of COVID. And I had to explain to her, you know, having other people in the home, their parents may not be comfortable with them coming over, but I'm not comfortable with them coming over either, because you have to be aware of your surroundings and you don't know who is around who, and some people wearing masks and they weren't wearing masks, and the whole life process was a little different. And trying to explain that to a child who wants to be social and needs to be social, it could be a challenge, and getting her to realize the importance of self-care, being covered, with your mask and whatnot, but still trying to navigate those friendships and be quote-unquote normal was a big deal.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I bet.
Yeah.
During the initial part of COVID and the lockdown and the restrictions, did you have to work at home?
I did. And ironically, when it first started coming over, or we were expecting it to come over to the U.S. My employer, we were already sort of in the midst of planning what to do, how to prepare, etc. And I was working in the office one day, and my manager was working from home, and I had a terrible cough that was starting. And I guess to other people, I sounded way worse than I felt, but I could hear her concern in the phone. And ultimately, I only had the flu, luckily, but the fear of just the common cold and not knowing was apparent, with everybody. But I reflect back on that, and just hearing her concern in the phone was different. And luckily, I only had the flu. Obviously, so many other people were not as lucky.
Yeah, I can imagine. As someone who works in HR, what was your experience like during that whole transition? Because I feel like there would have been a lot of phone calls or questions or struggles that many people faced.
Yes, well, I would say Zoom became our friend,
Mm-hmm.
as everybody else's. So work hours were a lot longer, and working from home, sometimes you really can't sort of separate from it. But trying to develop new processes with things that you need to do on a daily basis that you're accustomed to doing in person was a challenge. So you had to do more with less or more with different. But I'm a nurturer by nature, I'd say. And some of our employees, just like other, organizations, they struggled with dealing with the change. Some people work well from at home, some people don't. I'm personally a person who prefers to be in the office. But when there was a fear of if a person had COVID, I noticed that there was very much so a level of guilt, of feeling like I got it, where did I get it from, and I'm possibly exposing it to other people. Not that they were doing it purposefully, because we were all, in the same boat, but that person sort of carrying that burden and being ashamed that they may have gotten something that they had no control over getting. So it was very unusual, lots of emotions, lots of concerns for their own family members when a person got it, and then if they were still in the home with their spouse or partner or kids or whatnot, and then people with underlying health conditions, there's a greater risk.
Yeah.
I got COVID last year. I think my daughter brought it to me, honestly. She, I think, was not asymptomatic, but her symptoms weren't as strong. And then I got it right after her and dealt with the symptoms for about 2 months. And then later in the year, I started getting symptoms again. I didn't have it, but I think I had long COVID, and I think I still deal with issues of long COVID, losing my voice, fatigue, and just for the past couple of weeks, I've had headaches for the past about 2 weeks. I've had mild headaches, and I'm very seldom ever sick, so it's unusual and scary, not knowing, what the future will be.
I'm so sorry to hear that, Renee.
Thank you.
I can imagine how hard that is, the unknown and the lack of control.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think, and I've seen a lot of news coverage about this in certain places, particularly with minorities and African Americans in particular, that the issues of long COVID and what it means, because so many African Americans have underlying health conditions with, heart conditions, high blood pressure, diabetes, all of these different things, and not knowing what will happen, even 2 months down the road of how your illness due to long COVID will impact your chronic health condition. So we'll see.
Yeah.
Being healthy and being conscious still of your surroundings is important. I think all of us go without a mask sometimes. I still see some people still wearing a mask religiously, which is a great thing. But I think nobody likes wearing them. Sometimes they're hard to breathe in. And, just obviously living has changed. The way we live and the way we interact with each other is different. When somebody sneezes, I was in the store the other day and a person was sneezing and I stood there for a minute and then they sneezed again and then I had to move over because, you just don't know. And the people get the weird looks like, what's wrong with you?
For sure.
They do.
So during that time when you were working more from home and you talked a little bit about feeling lonely, and especially the weeks that your daughters are with, your ex-husband, and what did mental health look like for you?
Well, of course, lots of phone calls and Zoom and FaceTiming and all of that kind of stuff. But I developed hobbies. So I would walk every morning before work. And typically I would walk about 3-4 miles before work in the morning. And then on the weekends it would be almost double that because I would have more time. So that was helpful, being out and being able to see a person, across the street or whatever, was a good thing. I also started gardening and doing like potted flowers and different things like that, and bird watching and feeding the birds, but then I was also feeding the squirrels too. So they were very common visitors to my home. So that was very relaxing. And I would say just getting back to the basics. Bought a bike, got my daughter's bike, being able to go back to things that I used to do when I was younger. And, nowadays everything is technology and video games versus just basic stuff. And I think that appreciation for those basics became a big reminder to a lot of people.
Very, very true. You mentioned the news, and you mentioned that it impacted you a lot during the last few years. Can you talk a little more about that?
Sure. Well, years ago, I was I would say a very regular news watcher, but over the years, I sort of stepped away from it a little bit. But during COVID, we were just sort of forced, you're listening to the numbers, you're watching what's going on in other cities, you're watching, I remember there were some churches here that still kept having functions, and they had what they call those super spreader events, and I remember we were talking about that at my job, and I remember 2 churches in particular were African American churches. And so the issue of assuming that it wasn't people or minorities spreading, COVID was false, because people are people, and they were doing their events, and unfortunately the numbers from those events just kept growing. So that was very interesting. I would say one of the most memorable things was having to deal with the death of George Floyd, and it sort of coming into our home. I watch the news and watch other things sometimes, but I get more of my news in other different ways. But it was sort of forced into your home in a way that you couldn't ignore it, and then we had to talk about it. So not only COVID, but then you're home and you're dealing with the death or murder of a man who happened to be a black man by a man or a few people, but particularly a man who was white. And we were forced to talk about those issues of inequality in regards to social justice and police brutality. But then just the conversations of having to deal with talking to your coworker and trying to explain experiences that they may know nothing about just because they haven't had to live it. There is a reality of being a minority, and you have to be a minority, but you also have to be a minority living in this country. And those are 2 different things. And minorities have to be able to balance that, whether they want to or not. Where a person who is Caucasian lives as a Caucasian American without all of the extra issues that minorities have to deal with. But not only were we dealing with COVID and sometimes the inequalities of service or education or self-awareness of what we needed to do, but then also dealing with, we just saw a man being murdered on the street by the people who were supposed to protect us. And that was, that's hard, and it's still hard.
Yeah. I cannot imagine. Can you, if you're comfortable, would
Mm-hmm.
you mind sharing what those conversations look like?
Yeah. So, you know, since I work in HR at that time, the company I work for took the opportunity to give employees an outlet to be able to express their concerns and have conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And we had it via Zoom. People could join. It was totally voluntary. So we had people who would join and talk. We had people who would join and listen, and that was perfectly fine. And I remember sharing a few things, you know, with them because I was leading the conversations and telling people, you know, when you come to work, that there is a population of amongst all of us who only talk to somebody, who only speaks with someone who does not look like them, only while they're at work. So meaning they're white people who in their personal circle do not interact with any other minority group outside of being at work. And that's the reality. Um, and then there's also reality where minorities have to come to work and they have to, as they call it, code switching or put on a certain face while they're at work to be able to get through the workday, to be able to produce the work effectively, and to assimilate or fit in. And then when they go home, then you have to take all of that off, you know, maybe literally or just for the sake of um, appearing to be accepted by the majority or by the white race. And that's a taxing thing. That's a heavy burden on top of all of the other issues with COVID and whatnot. So we had some really honest conversations. I remember there was a lady who said, you know, the first time she had interacted with a black person was when she went to college. She had never, in her home, and in her hometown, had never interacted with a black person. And unfortunately, that's not unusual. That's, you know, a reality. Um, but then you have some people who have either married or had children with people of the opposite race, and then they have to deal with the issues of having a child who ideally in this country, and I would say in this world, identifies that child as being black because of the one drop rule, but they live in a white household, and there are, you know, differences. And seeing or hearing rather the comments that people were experiencing from social media from their families, because then this ugly murder happened, everybody was sitting on one side or the other in regards to how they felt about it. But then your friend, your family member, your cousin is able to share their thoughts on social media, and then you're like, oh, I didn't know you felt that way. Or, you know, or yes, I feel that way too. But it was very eye opening. And, you know, today we're still dealing with those issues, but it wasn't the first time a black man has been killed on video, and then we saw it on the news. And I remember asking my coworkers, like, what was different, you know, this time? You know, and I said, what was different about Mr. Floyd compared to all of the others? And they said, because we were at home and we had to watch it. So if it wasn't for COVID, would it have been as, would it have been given the attention that it needed to? Would things have changed? Or would it have been just yet another murder swept under the rug and you just move on, you know, like it's normal? It's not normal, but in this country it has been normal.
Very, very, very true. In terms of, at that time you were working at that one company and now you're working at a different company, would you say that those conversations are also freely had at your new company, or do you think it differs?
Well, I think the timing is different because we haven't had, like, everybody's processed that death. They've gotten mad. We've had our marches, we've picketed, we've done all of these things, and now it's like, okay, next, you know, sort of like the school shootings or the mall shootings or, you know, whatever. It's like you develop a filter to the violence. You get mad for a little bit, and then once you deal with all of that, then you're on to back to a normal, you know, society. So, there will be opportunities to talk about things of diversity, which are really important because, the reality is we're not going anywhere. And the population becomes more diverse as people, intermarry or as the white population decreases and other populations increase. But we have to be able to work together and live together and have very honest conversations to make sure we understand each other, because we have very similar outlooks on life of what people want. People want to live, make a living, have a good home, have good opportunities for their children. That is not unique to one race. That's across the board. But the problem is, just as we saw with COVID, is there equality to those same services or opportunities to all? And in this country in 2023, we're still trying to get there, and it's, honest conversations have to be had.
What do you wish you could see?
In regards to change or diversity? Oh wow, that's a little question. I think it all starts with education. I can only imagine what it would have been like for young girls to have been able to see the black females who were working for NASA. I'm sorry, I'm having a brain freeze, the movie. Because, girls in particular are always, sort of taught that, math is not for you, that's more of a male, thing. But to be able to expose children to all history at a young age is important, because then you can try to break down some of those things. Children are not born with racist or discriminatory thoughts. It's a learned behavior. It's just a simple fact. But because we have not been that far out of slavery, because we haven't, slavery didn't end that long ago. There are people who are still alive who, very few obviously, but whose grandparents were slaves. I remember telling someone when we were talking in those conversations, my mom and her siblings, they used to pick cotton, as it was work. That's what they did, so those, the opportunity to teach people at a young age the truth about our country, the beauty as well as the ugly parts, will only be able to help us to move forward. And you hear the term, I'm sorry, having a brain freeze, the process of educating all students on true African American history. That we don't want to do that. We don't want to remind the white students that their ancestors did these things, because somehow it's going to impact them negatively. But the fact is that they benefit from those processes, and that's just the truth. But I don't think that black people or any other brown person is trying to hold that child accountable for those challenges. But they just want to recognize that we are here and that our ancestors greatly shaped this country too. If we start with education, I think that will go far. I think people have to be willing to go outside of themselves and to talk to and engage with people who look differently than them and try to understand their concerns, but that also not to victimize people and assume that they fit in one box just because they look a certain way.
Very
so
true.
There's lots
Thank
of work
you.
to be done.
Thank you for sharing your perspective, Renee.
You're welcome.
In terms of, coming out of the restrictions, going back to COVID, coming out of the restrictions and kind of living a life where you're able to do a little more.
Yeah.
What is that? How has that impacted you, and where are you now?
Sure. Well, as a mom, my kids are always the first priority, and I definitely see a change and shift in them. Having the ability for them to go back to school in person did wonders for their mental health as it did for all children. They need to be able to engage. And I remember talking with the teacher when they first went back, because my daughter said, well, we can't talk to each other in school. And I said, well, what do you mean? She said, they won't let us talk to each other. And so I followed up with the teacher, and the teacher said yes, that they have to, stay within their own little bubble because they were trying to prevent, the spread. But that's almost just as bad as keeping them, and I understand why they had to do this, but keeping them at home learning, and where they're looking at the person on the screen, or not sharing their screen and not seeing anybody, or nobody seeing them, versus being in a space with other people and not being able to talk to them. That was the issue. But I would say in the last year and a half, definitely as things have eased a little bit, and we've become a little bit educated of how to live with COVID, because clearly it's not going anywhere. It's become easier for a mother with my children, and easier for me too. I've, had to adjust, probably going back to some of the more normal ways of living. But the reality is, when you go to a store and you see a whole family come in with masks, sometimes it makes me feel like, gosh, am I doing the right thing? Am I not wearing a mask? Should I wear a mask? You just don't know. Everybody's different, and what works for one person may not work for the other. But we have to find a way to be able to better navigate a healthy life, and hopefully figure out the stem of the problem and prevent it from happening again. Yeah, but I'll leave that to the scientists.
Yeah. Before we end today, is there anything else, Renee, that you would like to share with us? An experience or a story or anything?
Let me think about that. Great question. I was looking back at my chart here. I think for me, trying to stay motivated to, I guess, see it through and not knowing what might happen. I lost one cousin from complications of COVID. Since then, I've lost two other cousins for different reasons.
Sorry.
Oh, thank you. One cousin had sickle cell anemia, and so just learning how to live with him when he was living, and being able to see him and interact with him, because that was a underlying health condition that made him more vulnerable. So recognizing that life is so precious, and you never know from day to day what may happen, that we need to learn to be kinder to each other. We need to try to understand each other better, and not let the stress consume us so much. At the same time, I would say we need to recognize that there are people who live among us who are without. Food access is an issue. Housing access is an issue, especially here in Charlotte, but I see it in the smaller communities too. If you pay attention and watch, you can see a person who is homeless. If you watch them close enough, you can see. And just the other day, actually, I was driving down Beatty'sford Road to my daughter's school, and I looked to the right, sort of at the corner, I think it's LaSalle, and there was a man laying on the ground at the grass, like right in front of the bus stop area. And clearly he was sleeping, he was napping. That's where he was during the day. Where he goes at night, who knows. I think we will continue to see issues. That loneliness factor, I heard someone say the other day when they talked about it, the loneliness that people deal with, and the mental health struggles that a lot of our populations deal with. It impacts us all. It may not impact you in your home when you go home, but when you go out and deal with other people in the world and you have to interact with them, not knowing what would happen or what can happen because that person has not been given the treatment and access to healthcare that they need is an issue. So I would say that we all need to be more understanding. And I try to do that, to try to give back. Yeah.
Thank you, Renee.
You're
Anything
welcome.
else you want to share before we finish?
Honestly, I think just the only thing, I really appreciate you all doing this. And I always say that the library is wonderful. I love the library, but this is an amazing opportunity here in Charlotte. And you were saying earlier that nobody else is doing this, to your understanding, no other library system. So this is an amazing opportunity, and hopefully more people will take advantage to tell their story too.
Thank you, Renee.
You're
Thank you so
welcome.
much.
Thank you.